Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah. Wassalatu wassalamu ala Rasulillah. In the name of Allah, the compassionate, the most merciful. All praises due to Allah. And may His peace and blessings be upon our beloved Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And to all of our viewers, wherever you are, whatever time it may be, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. May the peace and the blessings of Allah be upon you and upon us and upon our loved ones, Ya Rabbil Alameen. And welcome again to our Thursday. Let us talk about it, where we like to say it like it is, inshallah, Ya Rabbil Alameen. Glad to be joined by my colleagues, Sister Suha Dweik and Sister Emily Oqlah. Welcome to both of you, sisters. And as we are proposing that in our Thursday talks, we have 4 plans, inshallah, or we like to achieve 4 things. And that is, number one, whenever we speak about mental health and mental health related issues, we like to destigmatize mental health. We like to educate our community. We like to offer support to those who are going through mental health related issues along with their loved ones. And number 4, we like to create activities and support policies that would make life easier for those who are going through mental health related issues and their loved ones. And hopefully, inshallah, tonight, in the coming nights, in the past nights, we are working in achieving these objectives. And welcome again to both of you, Suha and Emily. And tonight we have an interesting topic. We will be discussing what is the S word. Sister Suha, what are we talking about? And what is the S word? And why didn't we just spell it out?
Yeah, so the S word today is going to be suicide. And, before we get started, I know the S word is not something we discuss very often. And it could be a topic that can sometimes bring up some strong emotions. So just want to let you know, first of all, that these emotions and reactions, if they're coming up, are totally okay and totally normal. But if you are experiencing some of those and they're getting a little bit too much, that know that it's completely okay to turn the talk off if you need to. So, what is suicide? Really, suicide is a death that's caused by a self-directed behavior that has the intent to end one's life. But if you really step back, it's more, if you think about it, it's an attempt to solve a problem that has of intense emotional pain, but without having the proper problem-solving skills to do it. So just to go maybe over a couple of stats before we really get into the topic. So to start up, for every 25 attempts of suicide, or there's 1 documented death. Globally, every year, over 800,000 people die from suicide, which roughly is about 1 person every 45 seconds. So if you let that sink in, that's 1 person less than a minute. And really, the number of lives lost by suicide each year globally is more than the number of deaths to homicide and war combined. Now, nationally, suicide is actually the 10th leading cause of death overall in the US. It is the 2nd leading cause of death among young individuals between 15 and 24 years old and 25 to 34 years old. And sadly, since 1999, suicide rates in the US have increased by 35%. Overall, men are about 4 times more likely to die by suicide than women, even though women are more likely to attempt suicide. But that really goes back to the fact that men tend to use more lethal methods or means of attempting suicide, and they're less likely to seek help. Women are a little bit more likely to ask for help. Now, a little bit more locally, or in Tennessee, on average, we have about 1 person that dies by suicide every 8 hours. Tennessee's actually ranked number 22nd in the US for suicide rates. And in Tennessee, suicide is the 9th leading cause of death. The second leading cause of death for young people between the ages of 25 and 35. And unfortunately, the third leading cause of death for really young people between the ages of 10 and 19.
Mm.
So, despite all these staggering statistics, there's still so much stigma surrounding suicide. So I want to bring that to you, Sheikh Fazaga, and want to know why you think that is.
Yeah, and like you said, these statistics, subhanallah, are just absolutely crazy. And the sad part is, and that's not just about suicide, but it seems like mental health in general has such a great impact on people, and yet we don't discuss it as much as we need to. And I think that the great part of it has to do with stigma. And stigma, just to accommodate as many of our viewers as possible, stigma in Arabic is what we refer to as wasma, wasma ta'ar. Okay, and when people speak about stigma, the way that we define stigma is that it is the experience of shame or disgrace that sets people apart and identifies them as being different or undesirable. Nobody wants to be stigmatized. And I think that the key word here with as we're talking about the definition of stigma, it is people or when people experience shame or disgrace that sets them apart and identifies them as being different or undesirable. Nobody wants to be part of that group. And just also for the sake of definition so that people know what it is that we are talking about when we also speak about discrimination, and that is when people are viewed less favorably or the treatment that they receive is less favorable of other people, which might include being less able to access opportunities and resources. So people do not talk about these things because of the stigma that is associated with suicide, mental health in general, but specifically also about suicide. And I think also the second reason in our communities is there is a belief within religious communities and generally speaking, but specifically within a Muslim community, that is these issues do not happen in our community because we are believers, because we are committed to our religious beliefs. Therefore, we should not really waste time in discussing these topics because they really just don't happen amongst us. And if it does, it happens for people who are less religious or people who are not practicing. And I tell you, this is a fallacy. This is more of wishful thinking. This is literally daydreaming. This is a myth. It's a misconception that really needs to stop. And I think we discussed this in our program when we spoke about when bad theology leads to bad psychology. But just to let the people know, it is very possible, it's very conceivable that you can be a good practicing Muslim, yet at the same time, simultaneously, you can be suffering from mental health related issues. It doesn't take away from your religiosity, it does not take away from your faith, it doesn't take away from your, being just a good believer. People can be very tender in their heart and yet very troubled in their mind. And then lastly, I think that even when we speak about suicide, the tendency is to bring relevant texts to let the people know that committing suicide is a sin in Islam. I think that's great. However, I don't think that we should stop there because a good number of people, they know that this is haram, they know it's a sin, but yet they go through with it anyways. And here's what's going on. Yes, there is enough text in the Quran and in the Sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam to tell us that it is actually haram. Very quickly, explicitly in the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَلَا تَقْتُلُوا أَنفُسَكُمْ إِنَّ اللَّهَ كَانَ بِكُمْ رَحِيمًا. And do not kill yourselves. Indeed, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is surely most merciful towards you. Do not kill yourself here. It can either refer to murder, do not kill each other, or do not be guilty of suicide. Or in the hadith, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam speaks as to this idea of من قتل نفسه بحديدة من قتل نفسه وشرب سما. This idea of people killing themselves by a rod, like an iron rod, or people who kill themselves by, drinking poison or poisoning themselves. The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam speaks as to the kind of punishment that they will receive in the hereafter. It's the Prophet sallallahu would speak about people who just throw themselves down. So I think that there is enough text in our religion to tell us that Islam has a very uncompromising position when it comes to suicide. However, I believe the approach of telling people something is haram and stopping there, I really do not believe that is enough. And I am hoping that, inshallah, in tonight, in your company, both of you and Emily, I am really hoping that we will help people out there. And before I take it back to Yusuf and Emily, here is why our viewers need to really pay attention to this. 80% of the people, prior to them completing their suicide, and I think we like the word completing, and Emily will explain that in a second. 80% of the people, prior to them completing suicide, they reach out to somebody. They make a phone call. They send a text. They make a statement. It is almost like the very last call for help. We want to know about these things so that we are able to help, so that we're able to help the people.
Yeah, and Sheikh Fazaga, I wanted to jump in just to encourage our viewers at home to even say the word suicide as they're watching along with this, because when I think of suicide and how much stigma is attached to it, I think of it almost as like a curse word. It's a word that we don't say out loud. It's a word that we don't say to one another, and it's maybe a word that we don't really even like to hear. And so I'm hoping that even just saying the word suicide can bring it to an awareness a little bit and maybe destigmatize it some, to where it becomes easier to say and easier to talk about with our loved ones and with our friends and with our community.
And I know we will do this, Emily, and thank you for bringing that up. So we will talk about the misconceptions and the myths, but sometimes people believe that, if you discuss these topics openly, you are giving people ideas, and that is absolutely not true, people. This is just absolutely not true. Or, discussing these topics, in public like this for our community, people might potentially lose their innocence. And I always like to tell people, please remember, there is a difference between innocence and ignorance. It's nice to be innocent, but it's not commendable to be ignorant. And this is what we are hoping to do here tonight, inshallah. It's all yours, Suha. Back to you.
If you don't mind pulling up the PowerPoint.
Yep.
I think I wanted to see, Sheikh Fazaga, what you think, if we can go over some of the myths around suicide, kind of going off of what you just were saying right now. And so I think one of the first myths that people have around suicide is that confronting a person about suicide will make them angry and will increase their risk of committing suicide. But I'd like to see what you or Emily have to say about that myth, and what the fact part of that is.
Yeah, I agree. It's a myth similar to what Sheikh Fazaga was saying earlier, that if you bring up suicide with someone else, that one, maybe it will make them think about it, or it will cross their mind when it previously wasn't there. Or Suha, like you mentioned, maybe it will make them angry, maybe it will make them emotional. And another myth that is, I think, related is if someone mentions suicide and you think that maybe they're acting out or they're seeking attention and you don't believe them. But the reality is, if someone's reaching out and saying it, or if someone is maybe getting emotional when suicide comes up, those are signs to look out for and things to be aware of in order to reach out to someone who's in need of help.
Yeah, so honestly, you don't feel scared about approaching somebody with asking about suicide, because asking somebody directly if they have intent to commit suicide actually, lowers their anxiety. It opens up the communication and allows them to maybe talk about it and lowers the risk of acting impulsively on those feelings. So that's a myth. Definitely, if you see somebody, you see warning signs, go ahead and approach somebody and ask them directly. You're not going to cause them to kill themselves. You're going to help them.
And I think it's just well stated and very well said. And that's where I believe that ignorance breeds fear. I think that we are afraid, and because of the misconception and the myths that we have. Look, this person, yes, looks very depressed. They look like they're very, very tired of life and living. And I am afraid that if I bring up suicide, I'm either going to offend them or that I am going to give them ideas. And believe me, both of them. See, when you ask the question, there is a follow-up action. So say, are you thinking about suicide? If they say yes, the point is not just to leave it there. The point is that you will do something about it. And if they say no, at least you inquired, because that was an ethical duty that we have when, as we are learning about the warning signs and the risk factors. Once you notice some of these things, we want to point out and say, look, I'm just seeing this. Is something going on? And I believe it is very wise on our part. And I must really warn the people out there, as we're talking about this, please do not psychoanalyze your family members or your friends or co-workers. So this is something that this is for informational objectives. So we don't want people to be going around and accusing people of that, inshallah.
I do want to mention one more myth that I think a lot of people might have is that only experts can prevent suicide, and that is absolutely not the case. Suicide is definitely everybody's business, and we can all kind of do our part to help prevent it. I think it's really important for everybody to be vigilant and feel responsible, especially if you're noticing somebody is struggling or having some of these thoughts. So don't feel like you have to be an expert or have to know something about it. Showing that you care sometimes is enough, and that's the first step that you can take to help somebody struggling with that.
And remember, so also what you said, 80% of the people don't reach out to experts. They reach out to their friends. They reach out to their family members. So it's not like, let me call, I mean, we're happy that you'll be calling a hotline or crisis line. That's great. Or calling 911 or calling the hospital. But most of these people want to reach out to somebody that they already know.
Yeah, 100%. Another myth is that, and like just people that are talking about it, usually like people that talk about suicide, they don't do it. But again, that's absolutely not the case. If you're seeing somebody talking about suicide, they may be thinking about it. And it's actually one of the verbal signs, verbal warning signs of suicide is somebody who's mentioning it, talking about it. It's almost like them asking for help indirectly.
Yes. And again, remember, so whatever it is that is being said here is we're saying that this is based on observation, and studies have been done after the fact has taken place, people, tracing back what took place and what have you. So, and there will always be an exception. There is somebody who might just do it without having mentioned a single word of them, thinking or entertaining suicide. You know who comes to mind when this topic comes up? I remember about 6 years ago when Robin Williams committed suicide. And I remember I gave a khutbah about this. And I remember, by then, Mrs. Doubtfire has come out. It's one of the most beautiful movies. It's a very clean movie. I've watched it with my kids many times. It was just a really, really lovely movie. And the last thing that you would imagine is this is a comedian, somebody who's really famous, somebody who's really rich, what? And his job is to make people laugh, and you're creating jokes. So you must be having fun all the time. And yet people did not know, or few people knew, that he was going through depression, and he ended up committing suicide. So we may have a typical image of what are the kind of people that commit suicide, but a lot of people actually suffer in silence. And that is part of the stigma. that takes place. When you tell people that they belong to a group that is associated with disgrace and shame, nobody wants to go there, and a lot of people end up suffering in silence.
Mhm. Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely. Go ahead, Emily.
I was just going to say, I think that's a very great point, Sheikh Fazaga, that even though research shows there are certain warning signs, and we're saying here now, these are things to look out for, or maybe these are words to say or things to do, we can never truly know what's going on inside of another person. And I think on the other end, maybe if you're a family member who's experienced someone who has died by suicide, there can be that shame or guilt too associated with, why didn't I see it, and why didn't I notice it, or why didn't I do more?
Yeah, I think what you're talking about, Emily, is this idea of survivor guilt, and that is people who outlived a loved one that died by suicide, and then they're looking back and saying, "How did I miss all of this? How I could not see that?" And unfortunately, that's very common. I remember once we had a grant to just basically just talk to people who lost a loved one to suicide. And again, the guilt is just unbearable for a good number of these people, unfortunately.
Mhm. Absolutely. It's definitely heartbreaking for the family, and there's a lot of trauma that happens on that end as well. But I think it's important, having said all of that, to be mindful of the warning signs regarding suicide. So really they come in, there's 4 different types. There's verbal, behavioral, emotional, and situational. Um, and just know that the more clues and signs that you observe, then the greater the risk. So take all signs seriously, and it's a cumulative thing. But just to give like an example of some of the warning signs, they can be direct. So for example, a person can say, "I'm going to kill myself," or "I wish I were dead," or "If this and this doesn't happen, then I'm going to kill myself." But it can also be indirect. So it can be hints like saying, "Well, I won't be around much longer anyways," or "I'm tired of this life. I can't go on any longer. My family would be better off without me." But it's also important to be on the lookout too for some verbal clues, like things such as words where they're saying feeling hopeless or having no reason to live, feeling like they're a burden to their family or their loved ones, feeling hopeless, having no reason to live. Those are all things that you should be on the lookout for when people are talking, just to see if maybe they have thoughts of suicide. And so um, when it comes to behavioral, it could be things such as planning or looking for a way to kill themselves. So they're researching some methods, or they're maybe withdrawing from some of their activities. They could be isolating themselves from their family and friends. It could be giving away some of their prized possessions. So some of those are some of the behavioral signs to be on the lookout for. Um, and when it comes to emotional, people, considering suicide tend to display some of these moods. So obviously depression, but then also anxiety or loss of interest or hopelessness, feelings of humiliation and shame, uh, feeling relief or sudden improvement, which can sound kind of counterintuitive, but if you think about it, it may be because they're like, you know what, it doesn't matter. I don't have to worry about this anyways because I'm not going to be here any longer to deal with it. So those are some of the emotional things that we can kind of be on the lookout for with our loved ones and friends and people that are around us. And finally, one of the ones that we kind of maybe notice the most and it's easier to see is situational things. So it could be the loss or the end of a major relationship, such as a marriage, or the death of a loved one. And research shows that if somebody's lost a loved one to suicide, that actually really increases their risk of committing suicide themselves, which kind of goes back to what you were saying, Sheikh Fazaga, regarding the impact that suicide has on the family. Getting diagnosed with a serious terminal illness can also cause somebody to, have those feelings. Having financial issues, it can be your own or your family. Being the victim of assault or bullying, those are all situational cues as well that we should be looking for some warning signs.
Yeah. And that was nicely summarized, Suha. And just for our viewers, please, if you have a question, you can reach out to us on YouTube on the live chat. We are able to see them, and I know that some questions are coming, and we will answer them when we get a chance to do so. And here's the interesting part, what you were saying, Suha, earlier. 80% of the people who commit suicide do so because of either an undiagnosed or an untreated mental disorder. I mean, just for our viewers, just think about that. 80% who took away their own lives did so because of an untreated or an undiagnosed mental illness that this person that was going through. And of course, the most common one is depression. Okay, and almost all of the warning signs that you were talking about, they really revolved around depression. And please, most of us here drive, and as you're driving, there are warning signs. And what the warning sign is about is, look, heed the warning sign so that you won't suffer the consequences. And what we're proposing is familiarize yourself with these warning signs so that we can be of utmost help to ourselves as well as our loved ones, the people who are around us. But the key in what is just shared with us by Suha here is, please remember, 80% of the people who commit suicide do so because of an undiagnosed or an untreated mental disorder. And this by the warning signs that were just shared with us. So we've got two things. We've got warning signs and we've got risk factors. So the warning signs are about the individual and what they are going through, what their environment is like. The risk factors are in the presence of these issues, now we ought to be more concerned about suicide potentially taking place of this. And Emily, I think you're going to share with us what are the risk factors here.
Yeah, risk factors include individual components, societal components, aspects of the community or relationships. So it's kind of a combination of different levels of someone's life. It's kind of at the individual micro level and also at the larger macro level of community and connections. And while these risk factors might be true for people who end up dying by suicide, they may not always lead to suicide. So I want to share that caveat when we discuss the risk factors. And these risk factors, it's something to look for, especially for me as a mental health professional. There are certain questions that I ask every new patient that I meet with. I ask, have you ever attempted suicide before? Whether you made the attempt or maybe you got to that point but didn't actually do it. And that's because I know if someone has attempted suicide in the past, they're at a greater risk for doing it again in the future. That's the number one sign to me that someone is at a risk for suicide, is if they have attempted in the past. Another thing that I want to know is, has a family member committed suicide? Because as Suha was mentioning earlier, that's also a very big risk factor. There can be a genetic component, maybe depression runs in the family, or maybe the impact was so large that it also is passing on to someone else in the family who is committing suicide or dying by suicide. Something else that is a risk factor and that I ask about with everyone too, do you have any firearms in the home? Do you have any lethal weapons in the home? We know, and research shows, that people who have guns in the household are at a higher risk of dying by suicide or attempting suicide than those who do not. And some other risk factors that maybe aren't as thought of are with our elderly population and our elderly family members. People as they age can grow in their risk factor for attempting suicide or dying by suicide. And there's a few reasons why that is. One being maybe there's a loss of relationships. Maybe as people are getting older, their family members are dying, their friends, their marriage partners no longer around. Maybe their health is declining a lot, and it's very difficult to maybe live independently, and that loss of independence can be really difficult to navigate and to adjust to in older age. And maybe there's some fear of what it means to be old and maybe kind of lose some control as well. So we see our elderly population grow in their risk factor for sure.
Yeah, I think there's more. I think there are more risk factors that will be going through.
Oh yeah, thank you. Yeah, a big one, especially for the Muslim community, is exposure to stigma and discrimination. So we know that experiencing trauma, like being discriminated against, can increase your risk to suicide. That can be lifelong trauma, or it can even be acute trauma, like maybe a one really big event. And like Sheikh Fazaga was saying earlier, a risk factor for suicide is if you also have another mental illness like depression or like anxiety. And I will add like PTSD as well. PTSD is a very big one when it comes to suicide. Feelings of hopelessness, that kind of goes along with depression. Like you don't have anything to live for anymore, or losing the reasons that are keeping you here and keeping you hopeful. Feeling like you're a burden on others, that's something to look out for yourself, and maybe even noticing with other people if there's a constant idea of feeling like a burden and like they're being too much. Don't really want to talk to people about their problems or what they're going through. Isolation is a very big one. Withdrawing and not being around people. Withdrawing from family, withdrawing from friends, that's something to look out for in yourself and with others. And then also stigma and lack of access. Stigma keeps us from even saying the word suicide, like we talked about earlier, and even asking how someone's doing in relation to suicide or suicidal thoughts. And that's something I also wanted to talk about, was the difference between maybe passive suicidal ideation and active suicidal ideation. And when I say suicidal ideation, I mean suicidal thoughts of attempting suicide or thoughts of dying by suicide. And the difference between passive and active is passive, it's more of like, maybe everyone would be better off if I wasn't here. Maybe people wouldn't even notice if I wasn't around anymore. So it's not as, there's not as much of an intent with those thoughts. Whereas active is, I have the means of how to do it. I have a plan of how to do it. I know when, I know where, and I know how. And so it's much more of a immediate threat. And so I wanted to highlight those two, because they both feel scary, but one can feel a little bit more scarier than the other. And I think once you're hearing someone say something like, I know how I'm going to do this, I have a plan, that's absolutely an okay time, an appropriate time to call an ambulance or take that person to an emergency room.
Yep. Well stated. And I think just going back to what I think is really, really important here in what you said, Emily, is this whole idea of stigma. Please remember, this is a very powerful social force which allows one group of people to exclude or discriminate against another group, associated with disgrace, associated with concepts of shame and what have you. But once we stigmatize a group or an individual, remember that it would lower our motivation to seek professional help. It then also results in what we call self-stigma, or now the individual themselves are ashamed of needing help. So I know I need help, but I cannot really go there because as recent as yesterday, people would say, I am sorry, my loved one really needs to be seen by a professional, but I cannot get them to do so because they think that if they seek professional help, that they are weak, and they just could not bear the shame of reaching out to a mental health clinician or professional. And then sadly, I think with the stigma, it also does something to our sense of self. I think that it will just literally suck the self-esteem out of us. It will discourage us from seeking help or even seeking treatment. And then sadly, the stigma may not just be about the individual who's going through that issue, but it can also be the family around them where they really want to hide their own struggle with mental disorder, fearing the negative judgment of the community. And I think that is why it really is very, very important that our community becomes a place where people safe, that they won't be judged because a loved one, or a family has a member that is not doing well. And as a result, now that the family is struggling to hide this because of the fear of the negative judgment, now what we see happen also that the family may not get the help that they need or the support that can really, really help them, because in the process of recovery or whatever it is, because they're just too afraid of the stigma that has taken place. So I'm really, really hoping that in as we're talking about this, that we are absolutely able to eliminate the stigma of mental health, because this will really help the people who need the professional care, and they can make use of the support to get better, to seek the care that they need without fear or shame. And I'm really hoping that you just and I love what you're doing, Suha and Emily, because the whole idea is to normalize and validate. Remember, we're not celebrating any of this. There is no cause of celebration here, but we want to validate people's experiences so that they're not stigmatized, so that they're not ashamed, so that they don't feel disgrace, so that if they need help, they really can go out and now and reach that help.
Mhm.
And just to really, so what do we do to reduce that stigma? I think is that just make sure that you do not use stigmatizing language. Just be careful about what you say. Learn and recognize the warning signs and the risk factors. Educate ourselves about what is going on. Being approachable, approaching people who need help. These little things, they can really, really help in destigmatizing this whole notion of suicidality or just mental health in general.
Mhm.
Back to you, Suha.
Thank you so much, Sheikh Fazaga. And I really appreciate that you mentioned stigma, because within the Muslim community, yes, we're dealing with stigma, but we're also dealing with other life stressors. For example, discrimination is a little bit higher in our community. And so people are struggling with that as well. And it's just important for them to feel safe, to in their own community, be able to comfortably seek help. So it's so important to reduce the stigma and hopefully remove it completely within our communities, especially.
Can I jump in and add too? In terms of risk factors, I'm thinking about how we're in a COVID-19 world right now. And so we're already more isolated than we are normally. Maybe we're more depressed or more anxious than we would normally be. And maybe our coping skills are no longer as accessible as they once were. And that can even be going to the hospital or to a mental health clinic. It's nerve-wracking to go out in public when we're in a pandemic, in a global pandemic. And so I think I want to normalize that we're in a tough time, and that this is especially important of a time to reach out for help, because everyone is struggling in some way. And I think if you have those risk factors, or if a friend has those risk factors, or family member has those risk factors, it's just an extra thing to be aware of, that these things may be exacerbated just by the fact that we are in a COVID-19 world, on top of everything else that 2020 is bringing our way.
Nice.
Absolutely. And I think it's also important for us to be aware of if we are seeing loved ones or friends or coworkers or people around us that we feel may be struggling, to know how to approach or how to handle what we can do on our end to hopefully help prevent more death to suicide. And so one of the main ones is one of the main protective factors to reduce the risk are effective and accessible mental health care. So definitely knowing that it's okay to reach out, that by reducing that stigma and people feeling like, what, it's okay, I'm struggling, and that's fine. I can reach I can access mental health care to help me deal with this is really important. Having strong family connections and a support system is really important. It's also really helpful to just have really good life skills, such as problem solving and coping skills, emotion regulation, and conflict resolution, because we can't stop bad things from happening. We can't stop emotions and bad feelings from happening to us. But if we're learning good coping skills and we know how to handle them when they do arise, then that's really one of the best things that we can do to help prevent those feelings from going too extreme and kind of leading us down this path. It's also really helpful to have a future orientation, so plan ahead and have something to look forward to, because it's much harder to kill yourself or want to kill yourself if you have something in the future to look forward to, if you have a sense of responsibility to your family or friends. So that's something that can be really helpful, just as a protective factor as well. And also, obviously, like cultural and religious factors. And I can let you, Sheikh Fazaga, kind of talk a little bit on that, because I know sometimes there's a misunderstanding between people, just assuming that, oh, if I'm struggling, that means that my iman is not strong enough.
Yeah, and again, I think we discussed this extensively in our episode on when bad theology leads to bad psychology. What happens is that people believe that if they are practicing Muslims, they are inherently protected against mental illness, and that is just not true. That is absolutely not true. In the hadith, for example, the Prophet ﷺ says, ما أصاب المؤمن من هم ولا غم ولا حزن ولا نصب ولا وصب. Said that anytime anxiety, depression, weariness befalls upon a believer, he did not rebuke the believer. The Prophet, peace be upon him, spoke about the possibility of these things happening to a believer. And he said, look, in case this happens to a believer, and the key word here is that these things are happening to a believer. He never said that by virtue of you being a practicing Muslim, you are inherently protected against these things. And that is why I say these are just part of the misconceptions. And what happens as a result, the more we promote this type of understanding, the more people suffer. And not only that, but the more people suffer in silence. Or sometimes in our cultures, and it's not just the Muslim culture, and that is the culture, for example, African American culture, the idea of or the Arab culture, for example, the idea of seeking mental health, professional mental health. What happens is that that is associated with weakness. It is associated with the lack of support, which is not true at all. But that is part of the misconception and stigmatization that has taken place that absolutely just needs to really, really be destroyed. And it's not just about that. I mean, you got things such along the lines of, there is really no relationship. Having mental health issues is not lack of intelligence. It is not lack of iman, and it's not necessarily lack of people around you who care. So we would say, please remember these things. They happen to all. Across across religious, ethnic, cultural, linguistical, age, socioeconomic barriers. Everybody can potentially experience these things regardless of their place in society. And like I said, for us to pretend or to assume that these things don't happen in our community, that is actually not true. And you know who actually knows about this? Interestingly, you know, when we are asked to, you know, help with the burial, usually you get to see the death certificate. And a good number of these places, you know, the mosque would be calling me and say, Sheikh, you know what, we have a family, they just lost a loved one to suicide, and we just want to make sure that we offer your number as support. And it's just like the numbers are, I say, well, how often do you get these? And people would say, oh, we get probably about 2 to 3 a month. That is a lot. That is a lot when you think it's 2 to 3 a month in a small community. That is a lot of, that is a lot of people. And you know, according to the statistics that you read, Suha, it is one person taking their own life away in Tennessee every 8 hours. That is 3 people a day. That is a lot of, that is a lot of people. But keep in mind that suicide is a permanent solution for a temporary problem. But also suicide is just really about handing the burden over to somebody else. And in this case, that somebody else, we're talking about the, you know, about the loved ones that are going to, you know, outlive you, and you know, that's what's really happening with them.
Mhm. And I think Suha was bringing up a good point about community and connection being kind of a protective factor too. And I think that especially right now, because everyone is kind of isolating during this time and in quarantine, if you've noticed that someone seems to be more quiet, maybe even on social media, or maybe they're not texting as much, or you just haven't seen someone in a while, it it would be, I think, a good idea to reach out and say, hey, how are you doing? How is life lately? Or give someone a phone call, because we know that connection is such a protective factor for someone to not attempt suicide or to not die by suicide. And so I encourage everyone to reach out to people, especially if you're noticing any of these risk factors or warning signs. And like Sheikh Fazaga said earlier, not to psychoanalyze your community or your loved ones, but just to have an awareness that that extra phone call or extra text message or extra message on Facebook might really mean a lot to somebody else right now.
Yep.
And if you see, I mean, just to add, if you do notice some signs and you're thinking, okay, maybe this person is, struggling, then go ahead and ask that question. And when you do ask that question, if you're sensing that the person is a little bit reluctant, be persistent. Make sure that you maybe take them to a private setting so that they can feel a little bit more comfortable with opening up. Um, Allow them to talk freely and give them that space. And most importantly, give yourself plenty of time, because if you are bringing up a topic like suicide, you want to make sure that you're not rushed, that you're not making the other person feel rushed either, so that they feel more comfortable to really open up and open that, communication, because that really is one of the best ways to help somebody move away from it. And make sure that you give them resources if you feel that they're struggling, because there's a lot of resources out there, and sometimes that could be the difference between life and death for somebody. So just some of those, just wanted to mention that as well, especially in regard, if you do notice those signs, to make sure and address it and bring it up to the person.
Nice.
Yeah, I've heard before too, because I've talked about this with some other people before, and they're like, well, I'm not a mental health professional, so what would I do? What would I say if someone were to say, yeah, I am suicidal? And I would suggest to be non-judgmental and to listen to them and to not undermine or minimize what they're saying, and to believe what they're saying. And I think being a listening ear without even having to say anything can be very impactful as well. And I think we have some resources to share, so that if someone were to tell you that they are suicidal, they're having some thoughts, they have an intent or a plan, you can have some resources to give them.
Yeah, and I think just to add to that is definitely like listening, but making sure that you're not being judgmental, that you're not giving off that, so that they're they don't feel like, oh wait, is this like triggering something for them, or am I like saying something that now they think badly of me? So definitely removing that judgment is a huge thing, and that goes back to stigma, which we've been talking about today a lot. So
Yeah, and I think that we just want to make sure that we don't miss out on the statistics. You know, younger people are really, really at risk of that. You know, when you speak about it, is the third leading cause of death for people between 15 and 24. That is very scary because we associate this age group with fun, with, you know what, this is the time that everybody's having the life of their time, you know, to sweet 16, and then they're 21, and then they're 18, and they can drive. And we think that this is, you know, they're not paying taxes. And you know, you would think that this is like a really good time for them, but yet this is what is happening with them. So we also want to pay attention to that, because depression amongst teenagers is actually very common. Unfortunately, and I know that we will have an episode on self harm and self injury. We will talk about that later on, but we also want to pay attention to our teens, boys and girls, and we want to make sure that we observe the behavior and looking into the warning signs that we spoke about. And I think that, again, just very passionate about this whole idea of you know, some of the myths that are associated with suicide. You know, people speak about, you know, good life circumstances prevent suicide. Not true. Absolutely not true. People who belong to some wonderful families and a wonderful life, Robin Williams was a good example of that. That is just a myth. People who want to do it don't talk about it. Again, that is just another myth. And when someone is too depressed, they don't have the energy to kill themselves. That is, again, just another myth. And to me, to be perfectly honest with you, I think that ignorance might be the biggest factor that is actually continues to contribute why these numbers are, you know, still going up. It can either be on the part of the loved ones around the person who is going through that suffering, or the person themselves are not aware of, you know, the potential that's out there, the resources that are out there, the number of people that would absolutely love to care and help them out. So to me, just really the whole idea of you know, destigmatization and educating, I think that is really where it all that's where it all starts. By the way, we did receive a question from one of our viewers, asked about what about people who believe that people who commit suicide should not get a Muslim burial, which can cause their family members to think that they are not worth living. Now, in Islamic theology, like we said, that committing suicide is a great sin. It is actually considered a kabira, which it is a major sin. It is a major sin. It does not take you outside the fold of Islam. So a person who commits suicide, still they get a Muslim burial. We still, you know, bury them in the cemetery and what have you. I think what the person might be referring to is the scholars, somebody like Imam al-Nawawi, for example, they disliked for the Imam to lead the prayers, the Imam of the community, because there was an incident when a man was brought to the Prophet, peace be upon him, who was just cut his wrist, and the Prophet, peace be upon him, refused to lead the prayers. Other people, you know, prayed, but the Prophet himself refused to lead the prayers as a way to warn fellow believers that, look, this is a really, really serious sin. And the Prophet ﷺ himself is just not going to lead that prayers. He did not tell other people not to pray. So Imam al-Nawawi deduced, and other scholars, they deduced from this incident, they said that the person does receive the burial and the prayers, but it is encouraged that the community leaders do not participate as a way of giving a warning to those who are alive. Now remember, this is if the person has intentionally killed themselves, which is suicide, that was not necessarily due to mental illness. So for example, I personally have participated in prayers where I know the person, you know, completed suicide, but they did so because of an untreated mental disorder. So we know that it was, the person's judgment at that point was really, really clouded. So we would not apply that rule, because that rule is very specific to people who just did this, and it had nothing to do with mental illness. But that was a good question. I mean, it was a good question. And what we're hoping for, though, is, and you can see that most of the questions in our Muslim circles, they're very theological in nature. Do we lead the prayers? Does the person receive burial? And what have you? And these are absolutely great questions, and please do keep them coming, because we want to clarify these points. And I think that we also need to talk about how do we prevent it? What do we know about it, and how to deal with it? We have another question that also came up. Says, any resources for eating disorder that's a very specific place, South Fraser area of BC. I'm guessing that's British Columbia, for Muslim families. So I honestly do not know of any specific place in that area, but I would say, reach out, try to find, of course, Muslim resources initially. If not, then I personally recommend to reach out to somebody who is at least familiar with the Muslim culture. They may not be Muslims themselves, but they are Muslim, they have some kind of orientation. If not, they are willing to learn, and they're willing to ask questions. But hopefully, inshallah, whoever this person is, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ease your pain, ya Rabbal Alameen, and may you find the help that you need. Suha and Emily, any final thoughts as we are coming close to our ending time here?
For me, I just wanted to say, right, going back to stats, I think one of the ones that really struck me and just kind of stayed with me is that in Tennessee, suicide is the third leading cause to people between the ages of 10 and 19. And when I think of 10 to 19, I think of children. And so that's really heavy for me to have to think about. And so it just emphasizes how important this topic is, and that we need to make sure that we provide the resources for people to seek help, and for them to feel safe to seek help.
Mm-hmm. And I think,
and please keep in mind, cyberbullying is a major contributor to that. And inshallah, one day we will speak about bullying, but in this, cyberbullying, I know that cyberbullying has really contributed to this. Sorry, Emily, you were saying.
No, that's okay. I was just going to say, we all have internalized stigma, I think, when it comes to mental health and when it comes to topics like suicide. And that prevents us from reaching out, like we've been talking about all night. And I think challenging yourself to reframe it in your mind as it's not a sign of weakness to reach out for help, but a sign of strength and a sign of courage and a sign of bravery, because it's hard work to say, I'm struggling right now and I need help. And so to do that is, I think, a very wonderful, strong attribute of oneself.
Nice. And for me, I would just quickly go over an acronym. SAFE, SAFE. S, see the signs. A, acknowledge the distress that the person is going through. F, find the best response to de-escalate, reassure, and emotionally support. And E is to encourage to seek professional help and support. See the sign, acknowledge the distress, find the best response to de-escalate, and encourage to seek help from professional help and support. Suha and Emily, this was not an easy topic to talk about, but thank you for sharing what you shared with us. It was really informative. Jazakumullah khair. And may we never have to suffer anything like this. Not us, not our loved ones, not our neighbors, not anybody else. So if any of our viewers out there or their loved ones are going through difficult times, may Allah ease your pain. If you have lost somebody to suicide, may Allah bless their soul and give you lots and lots of patience, Ya Rabbil Alameen. And thank you for joining us this week. And inshallah, we will see you same place, same time. What is it now? I think we changed the time. We are an hour earlier now. So it was 9 p.m. Central Time, and now we are 8 p.m. And I think we're going to keep it at 8 p.m. for a while now, inshallah. Okay. So 8 p.m. inshallah next Thursday. Again, Suha and Emily, Jazakumullah khair. Thank you very much to all of our viewers. Until we see you next time. So long, and Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.